Hi everyone. First of all, for those who commented on my last video about not letting this world get me down, which was kind of a general message about mental health and about certainly I was thinking about my own situation, but I think people reflected that that was also a wider message, and it was. So thank you everyone who commented there and for your supportive and kind words. I do appreciate that. It's always nice to make a video and get positive feedback. So thank you for that. Um, I'm going to make a video before September 6th, i.e. before the new Prime Minister is installed, um, because they're not really inaugurated in this country, um, about Boris Johnson's legacy. I'm going to make a longer video about that, but this one I want to touch on something specific. Um, and I'll probably be bringing this into that other video as well, so there might be a bit of overlap, so please excuse me for that. But I'm reading the Times right now. I have a bit of a disclaimer here. I have a huge newspaper collection, huge, and I'm kind of it's like a queue of newspapers I'm reading through. I'll make a video specific about that actually because it's a long-standing hobby interest. So all those newspapers I'm busy reading through. So I'm backtracking now, but this is from August the 3rd, 2022. So that's a week ago. But it's an interesting report. It says Truss or Sunak, party faithful would rather Johnson stayed. Party faithful would rather Johnson stayed. The reports by George Grillis and Oliver Wright, who's a political reporter and policy editor, respectively. Okay, it's obviously the Times. I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but the interesting thing is 40% of Conservative members polled um, by just find out the source of this. I don't know if it's YouGov or yeah, it's YouGov. Incidentally, one of the early leadership contenders, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nadim Sahawi, was one of the founders of YouGov. So it must have been a bit of a strange feeling for him to be polling in the low numbers as he was by his own company. Must be a bit strange. I mean, the company that he founded. No conflict of interest. I'm not suggesting that he founded it, but 40% of Tory members would rather have Boris Johnson. That compares to 28% for Liz Truss, 23% for Rishi Sunak. My gut feeling is Liz Truss is going to be the next Prime Minister. All the current polling would seem to suggest that. Um, and I can number crunch on all these issues, but to be honest, in a tight leadership campaign like this, polling can change radically. So I'm not going to weigh too much on that. Suffice to say, Liz Truss has quite a strong lead at the moment. But the last debate I watched on Sky, the audience there at least thought Sunak came out stronger. And based on the performances that evening, I would have to say I'd agree with that. Truss was, she's, by her own admission, she's not the most savvy presenter, and it's not the most important thing, but it can, sometimes she looks like she's taken off guard and she could be quite, I mean, her comment about Sturgeon, um, was a bit flippant. Now, I'm a unionist. I know what she meant, which is that she, um, Nicola Sturgeon needs to respect democracy as well. But the problem was dismissing her in that way did look arrogant and unfortunately will backfire. So, someone who's going to be temporarily populist like that to pitch to a studio audience, there's a populist streak to Liz Truss, which is not always a bad thing, but if it's done on a spur of the moment sort of, well, I'll just pitch them. It's actually Johnson-esque. It's actually a little bit of a Johnson's quality, or vice or whatever you want to call it. There's something about Liz Truss's delivery, and I don't like. But I'm not a Tory. I don't particularly trust either of them. Although Liz Truss, I feel, has been a good foreign secretary. I don't particularly trust either of them, and I take issue with both of them. I don't like, for example, Liz Truss's dogged defense of Johnson, and I don't like some of the things that Sunak is pitching, like the threat to fine people a tenner if they don't show up to GP appointments. That looks like the sort of short term, like carrot stick thing that to give to Tory members, but it's not really been thought out because it says nothing about, for example, surgeries that cancel appointments on patients, and it's just punitive and petty, and I really don't think something like that should be a priority. Um, so I'm skeptical about things like that. Um, I'm not saying that there's no place for those sort of policies, but it just, I don't know, it kind of reeks of the sort of microstatism that Tories claim to be against. But what I want to talk about is Boris Johnson and what I believe is basically a personality cult around him. Now, this is a curious thing. And this percentage, by the way, I believe represents that what I'm going to be talking about. By the way, Kate Burley at the end of that debate, I don't know if you saw it, but she asked the audience, I didn't quite hear the question. I think it was, do you think it's fair that you are deciding the Prime Minister, i.e., a small group of people get to decide the Prime Minister for all of us? And they resoundingly said yes, yes. And one young guy was very sort of assertive on this, very gung ho. Oh well, Labour would do the same thing. They done it with Gordon Brown, and he was very. But what these Tory members need to realise is, yes, we elect the party. Yes, we never directly elected prime ministers, but they are in a privileged position in the sense that the leader of the party and thereby the country is effectively in their hands. So it is in that sense a privileged position to be in. It's sort of like if there's a general election debate and a person gets to question the two candidates, i.e., the leader of the Tories and the leader of Labour. It's good. I mean, I think citizens should question those in power, but most of us won't be able to. So those who do have a chance should do it well. It's pressurizing, if you're in a studio audience and the camera turns to you, I think you need a bit of confidence because unlike politicians, they're just ordinary people. So I think you need a good bit of confidence to do that. Um, whereas politicians are kind of groomed and they're for the public eye in a way that gives them a bit more preparation. Um, but this thing around Boris Johnson, I think there's a lot of reasons for it. First of all, how do I justify this designation of a personality cult? Because that has quite a specific meaning. We tend to think of, I mentioned recently about the sort of personality cult you get around celebrity. Well, the interesting thing about Boris Johnson is he's a quasi celebrity, so it may actually come into that. But we also tend to think of totalitarian dictatorships, Joseph Stalin's Russia, Mao's China, Putin's Russia for that matter. I should say Stalin's Soviet Union. Um, those are three well known examples, but there are others. A lot of dictatorships utilize this. Curiously enough, Hitler didn't. That's one curious thing about the Third Reich. The actual personality cult around Hitler was, I mean, there weren't mass produced portraits of Hitler to the same extent as Stalin and Mao. It was a dictatorship, of course, but it operated in a slightly different way. Um, Boris Johnson. So people might say, well, it's a jump to compare what's happened with Boris Johnson to dictatorships. But I'm not saying that. I think personality cults can take different forms. In our politics, it's an unusual situation, actually, because what you usually have with prime ministers and parties and governments is you'll have the usual partisan support. So Tories will support the Tories, Labour will support Labour, swing voters are undecided, and so on. So if you have a Conservative government, there will be a knee-jerk tendency for Conservative voters to support everything it does, or a lot of the things it does, and likewise with Labour voters. But I do not think there is anything like sort of knee-jerk responses to Boris Johnson from his supporters as there was around Theresa May, David Cameron, Gordon Brown, John Major, those four prime ministers. Tony Blair and Margaret Thatcher are a bit different because they were particularly successful prime ministers, electorally speaking. They were towering figures. I think they were the two biggest political figures in my lifetime in this country. I call them political giants. Controversial for sure, toxic figures to many, but no one could deny that. Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair had an enormous influence on British life and on this country. Rightly or wrongly, they did. Um, Whereas the others will go down with academics as all pretty mediocre prime ministers. None of those other four, Major, Cameron, Brown, May, they'll have some things people can look at the record, like, okay, this prime minister done that, or they're sort of normal prime ministers in the sense that they're not larger than life figures like Thatcher and Blair. I mean, towering political figures, and they're not either Boris Johnson. So Johnson's sort of unique. I'm trying to think of another comparison in British prime ministerial history, and I can't. I mean, there was Churchill, who was, of course, Churchill, voted the greatest Britain. I suppose you could say there's a little bit of a tendency for conservatives to fiercely defend Churchill's reputation, and I don't entirely agree with that. I think Churchill was probably the greatest Britain. I mean, the fact of the matter is his leadership saved this country during World War II. His leadership guided Europe through its darkest days, and he was rightly remembered as a towering, inspiring figure, one of the greatest figures of the 20th century, one of the greatest figures, if not the greatest figure in our history. But, but, I've always argued that no historic figure is above scrutiny. Churchill had a more negative side. There's no point denying that. He did hold some pretty racist views, and it was quite common at the time, those racialist ideas. I mean, Churchill was a Victorian in many ways, and he did hold some pretty Victorian views on things. Um, so I don't think that this is actually an area where conservatives can be politically correct, because the second they hear any detraction from the Churchill legend, they immediately pounce and think, oh, you must be a lefty, or that's kind of pathetic. No historic figure should be above scrutiny. And I don't like the way conservatives idolize Churchill to the point where they, you know, almost vitriolically attack anyone who thinks differently. I can understand people who are trashing Churchill and disregarding his many achievements and his leadership. But, we have free speech in this country, and conservatives should remember that. That includes the right to question the legacy of historic figures. So, Churchill, perhaps there is something of that around Churchill, but I still think Johnson is unique in terms of his personality, in terms of a lot of the just I think he's unique in prime ministerial history. I mean, if we get a time machine, maybe Robert Walpole or some of those 18th century figures could have something of the flippant side. Walpole had a reputation, for example, for being a bit of an underhand dealer and a very savvy operator in terms of his favoritism with King George I and his son. Um, so who knows? Maybe if we go back in a time machine and look at some of those leaders, but it was a very different time and a very different structure of politics. So I'm not going to give a long account here of Johnson's entire premiership, because, like any premiership, it's eventful. But he did have to deal with some very, very profound things, the biggest pandemic in a century. Um, that's something that no other leaders had to face on that sort of scale in this country. The Ukraine crisis, there's a lot of really big things, but I'll be looking at all of those things in my assessment of Boris Johnson's premiership. What I want to focus on here specifically is, like I say, the personality cult. Now, the general argument about Johnson's downfall is it goes two ways. It's either there are a bunch of traitors who stabbed him in the back, referring to senior politicians like Rishi Sunak, or Partygate was trivial and we need to move on. Now, this one really works me up because it's very insensitive to the millions of people, millions of grieving families, and it is millions when you get into the extended numbers of grieving families. In fact, it is millions when you consider the millions who sacrificed. So when these Tory members and Johnson apologists say, "Oh, it's a trivial thing, move on," they are utterly missing the point, because when you have someone who sets the rules and then breaks them, that's an abuse of power. And I'm tired of Liz Truss saying he made mistakes. Like, oh, it was an error of judgment. It wasn't an error of judgment. He knew he was breaking the laws that he set, that his government set. I honestly believe it was arrogance. I honestly believe, well, we're the ruling party. This will never be found out. What the hell, let's just do it. And let's be very clear. What the Sue Gray report showed was this wasn't a couple of drinks outside. This was quite a raucous party. Now, Johnson may not have been physically in the room, but this idea that didn't know what was going on in his own house, spare me. Spare me. So, it's one big problem I have with Johnson apologists, the fact they keep trivializing this, because for people who lost loved ones, who couldn't attend their relatives' funerals, who made very real sacrifices, it's really not trivial. It's not. I remember people were being interviewed at the time that the Partygate investigations were going on, and they spoke of their fury. These were people who had lost loved ones who couldn't hold the dying relatives' hands. There's nothing trivial about that. This isn't a case of the Labour Party just sticking up for a bit of dirt and oh, they shouldn't have done that. This has very real implications on ethics and public life. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it's akin to our Watergate. I really don't think that's an exaggeration because I think it goes to the highest level of ethics of public life. I really do. I think it's, if not de facto corruption, it's certainly moral corruption. And one of the disappointing things about this leadership race, it's the two people who are now running. They're both insiders. Now, Sunak resigned, but only at the last minute, and Truss didn't resign, and she has doggedly supported Johnson. She has failed to understand the wider public mood. So I think the Tories are being quite complacent. I think they're just assuming, well, Labour's divided, Labour's going to lose the election. But I think that would be very foolish. Starmer has his problems. Starmer has his challenges. I think Labour would be incredibly foolish to get rid of Starmer before the next election. Incredibly foolish. Um, because actually Starmer is actually doing quite well. Labour's winning by elections. In a lot of polls, Labour is leading. So why on earth would they get rid of Starmer? Because of the hard left's discontent? It makes no sense. Um, but this thing around Johnson, it's quite aggressive because anyone who detracts is immediately branded as unpatriotic, or if they're a Conservative member, they're seen as a traitor. I wouldn't be surprised if Tory MPs, for example, those backbenchers, they got hit full abusive messages. Um, I guess the equivalent in Labour is when you had Labour people who supported a robust foreign policy. I remember when Hilary Benn, for example, backed airstrikes against ISIS, that murderous death cult, he got loads of abuse online from the hard left, Corbynites, who think we should turn a blind eye to the likes of ISIS. Um, it was vitriolic. I think the Tory equivalent is any Tory MP who's seen to be anti-Johnson. How dare you offend the great leader? One does get that impression, and I have not seen this over any prime minister in my lifetime. Of course, politics is power, and in any government, you're going to have these questions of loyalty. And if you get a junior minister or a backbench MP resigns or crosses the floor, they will probably be roundly condemned by their own party because people do think they're stabbing them in the back. Like, I forget his name now, but the Tory MP whom earlier this year defected to Labour. Of course, there's going to be that sort of grouping together, but I have not seen this sort of tendency to slavishly defend a leader with any other prime minister, as has been the case with Boris Johnson. And I think there's a disconnect between the Parliamentary Conservative Party in that sense and members. And of course, a lot of it comes down to Brexit. I mean, he's seen as the man who delivered Brexit, and he technically did. Now, the Remain people could say a lot of that was based on lies, but If you look at politics as a politician delivering what they promised, then actually Johnson did deliver Brexit. I didn't vote that way, but he did deliver it. So it's a rare example of a short premiership that got some things done. I don't think it was a total disaster. I think it's a disaster in terms of the sleaze, but I think it's because he's Mr. Brexit that even though Johnson was never always an arch Eurosceptic, I mean, years ago, like Liz Truss, he was pretty pro EU, or at least he didn't have strong views on the issue. He was metropolitan. Johnson's went more to the populist right in recent years. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with the populist right. It's just an observation. It's been very successful as a strategy. He won a comfortable general election victory in 2019. Although the question is how much of this was down to Boris Johnson, how much was down to the fact so much of the British public were uneasy about Jeremy Corbyn. That's a question. But then again, Johnson did break red wall seats, so no one can deny he is a very shrewd political operator. He's no fool. He's no fool. Um, and I honestly think the whole clownish, buffoonish image is actually very, very politically savvy because it presents him not as a shrewd political operator, but as a bit of a buffoon. So in so doing, people think, oh well, he's too he's too flippant to be serious. He's too flippant to be calculating. I actually think Boris Johnson is very calculating. I think he's quite Machiavellian, actually. And the flippant way that scandal after scandal, he just dismissed things. Oh, I understand the public's anger and I'm very sorry. But it's basically one scandal on to the next. And bear in mind, this is a relatively short premiership, 3 years. But how many scandals has there been? The Chris Pincher thing, the Dominic Cummings thing, Partygate itself. It's just one thing after another. And those are the main ones. It may well be, I mean, I wouldn't entirely trust Dominic Cummings, but if Boris Johnson said that comment about bodies piling high, even if it was in a private capacity, that says a lot about it. That's horrendous. Now, it did come from Dominic Cummings, so we should take that with a pinch of salt. But still, I think what's happened with the Johnson administration is this is a man who's very, very popular with party members, and let's face it, with a large segment of the population. Now, what's happened in recent months is that popularity in the wider public has definitely decreased, but within the party, it's possibly got even more hardline. The fact that they're demanding he's on the ballot, the fact that they're calling people like Rishi Sunak traitors, and then you have the acolytes within parliamentary level, like Nadine Dorris, who's basically Johnson's yes woman, and others. It's and his own sister for that matter. I still maintain that she has she. I'm talking about Carol Johnson. I think that Carol Johnson is that. I'm probably getting her first name wrong. Um, she's probably getting the journalist I'm talking about at LBC. Ah, brain freeze. Anyway, I think that's a conflict of interest for her to defend her brother, um, whilst claiming, well, saying, "Oh, please don't insult me." Um, anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. I didn't intend to make it so long, but this is very unhealthy in a democracy to have this extent of dogged, blind support over one man. We're not a single party state. We're not a dictatorship, and no individual, as Johnson himself said in his resignation speech, although I think it was very flippant, no one is irreplaceable. Um, I just think it's very unhealthy to have that extent of a personality cult. And these Johnson apologists, these people who cannot see it, I get it, you can point to all his achievements, but do not downplay Partygate. Do not downplay the sleaze. Do not downplay the lies to Parliament. Do not downplay this massive degradation of public trust that he has caused. And yes, there's others. around him. But in the end of the day, he's the boss. He's the man at the top. And I honestly think Boris Johnson has really brought sleaze to the highest level. And probably after the video, I'll remember her first name. That's irritating. Boris Johnson's sister, blonde woman, journalist, brain freed. But anyway, I think she was wrong to forcefully defend her brother, but then complain about being criticized for it. Well, if you're a journalist, I personally think that she can defend her brother, but she has to understand there's a conflict of interest there. Nah, wasn't Carol. Brain freeze. Let me know your thoughts.